"We're too good for your cheap vacation," Mom said after I paid $5,000 for their anniversary trip. And if you think that line sounds like the start of a nightmare, you're right. Because it's the sentence that made me realize no matter how much I gave, my family would never see me as enough. Not as a daughter, not as a woman, not as a person who'd worked months of overtime shifts just to surprise them with something I thought would heal years of tension. Only to be told my gift was beneath them. Like I was beneath them, and in that instant, standing in the hotel lobby with the receipt still folded in my purse and their laughter ringing in my ears, I knew this trip was going to change everything. Because while they thought they were insulting me, they had no idea I'd already started planning the moment when the balance would finally shift, when their pride would crumble and they'd learn that gratitude isn't optional, and that the person you keep calling cheap might one day hold the kind of power money can't buy. I grew up being told that family was everything. But in my house, family meant sacrifice only went one way, and that way was always mine. Whether it was lending money I never got back, babysitting my sister's kids while she went on vacations she never offered to take me on, or being told I should be grateful to sit at the same table even when the food on it had been bought with my paycheck. And it's not that I didn't love them, I did. But love that only drains you without being refilled becomes something bitter. And over time, it felt like every smile I gave was a withdrawal from a bank account they never deposited into. So when my parents' anniversary was coming up, I told myself this was the chance to finally do something big, something undeniable, something that would show them I wasn't just the afterthought or the family wallet, but a daughter who wanted to be seen for once. And that's why I worked every extra shift I could get my hands on, nights that bled into mornings, weekends where my only company was the glow of my computer screen and stacks of receipts. And when I finally had the $5,000, I booked a trip I thought was perfect. A resort where they could wake up to the sound of waves, dine under the stars, and remember what it felt like to be young and in love. Because I thought maybe if they saw how far I was willing to go, they'd finally soften toward me. Maybe say thank you without that thin edge of mockery. And when I handed them the envelope with the tickets, my mom gasped and my dad raised his eyebrows. And for a moment, just a flicker, I thought I had done it. I thought I had cracked the code to their hearts. But then came her words, sharp as glass. "We're too good for your cheap vacation." And the way she said it, with a smirk tugging at the corner of her lips like she was amused I'd even tried, was the moment something inside me stopped begging, stopped reaching, stopped bleeding for them, and started planning instead. I stood there holding the envelope like it was proof of a crime. Like somehow I was guilty of caring too much, of trying too hard. And I remember my mom's voice echoing through the room, pitched loud enough that my aunt and cousins who had dropped by for cake could hear it too. And I watched the way their eyes shifted toward me, a mix of pity and smug delight, like I had just played the fool again. And my mother, who loved to perform, kept going, telling everyone that she and Dad deserved better, that $5,000 was nothing compared to what real children spent on their parents, that if I truly wanted to honor them, I should have gone for a cruise, or Paris, or at least somewhere exclusive, not what she called a discount island package, even though I'd gone through 3 different travel agents and scoured forums for months to make sure it was high-end. And as she laughed, I felt the memory of every other time she'd dismissed me stack up like bricks. The time she called my college acceptance cute while bragging about my cousin's law school. The birthday when she gave me a re-gifted candle and said I was too old for real presents. The Christmas she told me not to expect much because your sister has kids, and you don't. As if children were the only currency of value in our family. And what hurt wasn't just the insult, it was the way everyone else joined in, chuckling, nodding, letting the words settle like it was truth instead of cruelty. And I realized I had built my entire adulthood around proving I belonged to people who would never give me that membership card. Not because I hadn't earned it, but because they liked me better as the scapegoat. The one they could point to and say, "See, she tries, but she'll never measure up." And in that moment, while my cheeks burned and my throat tightened, something inside me went cold. A clarity I hadn't felt before. The kind that doesn't come from anger, but from exhaustion. And I knew then that this trip, this so-called cheap vacation that had cost me half a year's savings, was going to be the line in the sand. because while they thought they were mocking me, they had no idea I was finally ready to stop bleeding for them, to turn their own words into the rope they'd one day trip over. And the more they laughed, the more I smiled inside, because I knew what was coming next wouldn't be the humiliation they thought they were handing me, but the start of their undoing. They didn't notice me slip away that evening. Not when the living room filled with the hum of their chatter and clinking glasses as they made plans to upgrade the trip I had already paid for, talking about how maybe my sister could chip in more to make it something worthy of them, as if my $5,000 were just a down payment on their entitlement. And I sat in my old childhood bedroom, staring at the peeling wallpaper and the boxes stacked in the corner, boxes full of old report cards, photos, and journals where I had written about wanting to be noticed, wanting to matter, and I felt a strange calm wash over me, because I realized I didn't need them to change. I needed to change my position in their story, and that meant no more begging for love that came with a price tag I could never pay. No more twisting myself into knots to prove worth to people who only measured me in terms of what I could give. And that night I opened my laptop, pulled up the travel agency account, and with one steady breath I made a call that would tilt the ground beneath them. I canceled every single reservation, every room, every excursion, every prepaid meal, and when the agent asked if I wanted a refund to the same card, I said yes, my voice steady, my hands not even shaking. And then I did something I'd never done before. I booked something for myself. A quiet little retreat in the mountains. Nothing flashy, nothing performative. Just a place where no one would call me cheap. No one would laugh at my effort. Where I could wake up without dread in my chest. And when I closed my laptop, I felt lighter than I had in years. Because for the first time, I wasn't the family's safety net. I wasn't the butt of their jokes. I was someone who had choices. Someone who had drawn a line. And though I knew the explosion would come when they found out, I also knew I was ready. Because what they thought was weakness, my silence, my giving, my patience, was actually the thing that had taught me how to endure. And endurance in the right hands can turn into power. And I couldn't wait to see their faces when they realized the vacation they mocked as cheap was gone. And so was the daughter who once would have cried herself to sleep over their words. The call came 2 days later. Right on schedule, my mother's voice sharp enough to pierce through the speakerphone before I even said hello, demanding to know why the resort had called to confirm a cancellation, insisting there must be some mistake. And when I told her calmly, "There's no mistake," I canceled it. The silence on the other end lasted just long enough for me to imagine her face contorting. That mix of disbelief and fury that always came when I slipped outside her control. And then came the shouting, accusations that I was ungrateful, vindictive, cruel, that I had embarrassed them because apparently she had already bragged to her friends about the trip I was sending them on, painting herself as the mother with a generous daughter, and now she'd have to walk it back. And what I remember most wasn't her anger, but how little it moved me this time. Like her words were bouncing off a wall I had built without even realizing it. And when my father took the phone from her, his tone lower but no less cutting, telling me this was petty and small-minded, that if I wanted to punish them, I had succeeded, I told him something that had been buried inside me for years. I didn't cancel your vacation to punish you. I canceled it because you never deserved it in the first place. And when those words hung in the air, I could hear my mother in the background, sputtering, repeating, "Cheap, cheap, cheap," like it was the only insult she had left. And I felt something almost like pity for them, because they didn't see that the daughter they'd leaned on, mocked and dismissed, had finally stepped off the stage. And without me propping up their illusions, they had nothing to stand on but their own pride, which was starting to look very fragile. And though I knew they would spin this story to anyone who would listen, casting me as selfish or cold, I also knew that anyone who looked closely would see the cracks, because generosity without respect is just exploitation. And for the first time in my life, I was no longer willing to play the role they wrote for me. I was finally writing my own. When the family fallout started, it spread like wildfire, because my mother wasted no time calling my sister, my aunts, even distant cousins to tell them I had ruined their anniversary, painting herself as the victim of my supposed spite. And suddenly my phone lit up with messages that ranged from guilt trips to outright insults. My sister demanding to know why I couldn't just let Mom have her moment. My aunt reminding me how much my parents had sacrificed for me, as if I hadn't been the one covering bills and buying groceries when Dad was between jobs. And for a while, I just let the notifications pile up, the screen glowing with their words like tiny attempts to claw me back into the role I'd played all my life. But I didn't answer, because I had already decided silence was my new language. And it drove them crazy, because without my explanations and defenses, they had nothing to argue against, only their own noise bouncing back at them. And when my mom finally showed up at my apartment unannounced, banging on the door like the building was on fire, I opened it just enough to look her in the eye and told her flatly, "This is my space. You don't get to walk in here like you own it." And the shock on her face told me everything, because she had never seen me set a boundary that firm, never heard me speak without pleading underneath. And she tried, of course. She tried to soften her tone, to tell me I was being dramatic, that she had only meant the words as a joke. But I didn't bite. I didn't cave. I just said, "If that was your idea of a joke, you're the only one laughing," and closed the door before she could answer. And as I leaned against it, my chest rising with the first steady breaths I'd taken in years, I knew I had crossed into new territory, a place where I didn't need their approval, their validation, or their staged celebrations. And for the first time, I felt something that had always been foreign in that family: freedom. The weeks that followed were like watching dominoes fall in slow motion. Each call I didn't return, and each door I didn't open, setting off a new wave of outrage in the family. Until finally my sister came storming into my work one afternoon, red-faced and hissing that I had embarrassed them all, waving her phone at me with a group chat pulled up where my mother had written that I was jealous of her happiness, jealous of their marriage, jealous of everything I could never have. And though I once would have broken under that, feeling the need to defend myself, to send long explanations about how wrong they were, this time I just looked her in the eye and said, "If you believe that, then you've already chosen your side," and walked away, leaving her sputtering in the lobby. And the strangest thing happened. I didn't feel guilty, not even a little, because deep down I knew I wasn't destroying the family. I was just refusing to keep patching together a facade they had built on my silence. And without me smoothing it over, the cracks were finally visible to everyone. And when my dad called one night and left a voicemail saying they were thinking of postponing their anniversary celebration because they were too stressed, I caught myself smiling. Not because I wanted them miserable, but because for once their chaos wasn't mine to fix. It was theirs to sit in, theirs to own. And as I sat on my balcony with a glass of wine, the city lights glowing below, I thought about how many years I had wasted trying to prove I was worthy of people who thrived on keeping me small. And I realized I wasn't losing a family. I was finally stepping into my own life. And that clarity was worth more than any vacation, any approval, any apology I'd never get. It amazed me how quickly the narrative shifted once I stopped playing along, because at first they tried anger, then guilt, then the old standby of shaming me for being ungrateful. But when none of that worked, they moved into desperation, my mother leaving me voicemails at odd hours, her tone swinging wildly between tearful begging and icy threats, telling me I was breaking her heart and then, in the next breath, warning me I'd regret cutting myself off from the only people who will ever truly love you. And I sat on my couch listening to those recordings one after another, not with the heavy ache I once felt, but with a kind of detached clarity, hearing in her voice not love but control, not sadness but the panic of someone losing her grip. And it struck me then that my whole childhood had been one long performance where my role was to absorb her moods and make her look good, to smile for the family photos while hiding the sting of her words. And now that I wasn't performing anymore, the play was falling apart, and she didn't know how to rewrite it without me. My sister tried a different angle. She started posting on social media, little digs about selfish people who ruin special occasions, vague enough that not everyone would know who she meant, but specific enough that family friends could connect the dots, and I saw the comments roll in, half-hearted consolations and passive-aggressive suggestions that maybe she just needs time. and instead of feeling crushed, I realized how small their circle really was, how much energy they spent maintaining appearances instead of relationships. And for the first time, I didn't feel like the outsider. I felt like the one who had escaped. The irony was, I hadn't meant to start a war. I had just canceled a vacation they didn't appreciate. But it turned into a mirror they couldn't stand to look into. A reminder that their power over me was never unconditional. It only existed as long as I believed it did. And now that belief was gone, dissolved like smoke, leaving them flailing in the emptiness. And as the days passed, something inside me shifted. A weight I didn't realize I'd been carrying lifted off my shoulders, and I began to notice little things I had missed for years. The quiet joy of a morning where no one demanded anything from me. The relief of spending money on myself without hearing the word selfish. The thrill of imagining a future where my choices weren't dictated by what my mother might think. And in those moments, I understood the truth. I hadn't lost a family, I had lost a cage, and in its absence, I could finally breathe. The real breaking point came when my parents tried to stage what they called a family meeting, as if I were a rebellious teenager instead of a grown woman who had just spent half a year working myself raw to give them something they mocked. And when I walked into the restaurant where they had gathered, my mom, dad, sister, and even my aunt with her smug smile, I could see immediately it wasn't a meeting, it was an ambush. They had a speech prepared. I could tell by the way my mother's napkin was folded neatly in front of her. By the way, my sister kept her phone screen angled up like she was ready to record me losing my composure. And my dad started with his usual heavy sigh, saying how much disappointment I had caused, how I was tearing the family apart. And then my mother jumped in, accusing me of humiliating them, of making her look cheap in front of her friends. And as they went around the table, piling on their rehearsed lines, something strange happened. I didn't shrink, I didn't tremble. I didn't even feel the familiar heat rising in my chest. Instead, I sat back in my chair, folded my hands, and listened like I was watching a play I'd already seen too many times. When they finally paused, waiting for me to beg forgiveness or defend myself, I leaned forward and said in the calmest voice I'd ever used, "Do you hear yourselves? You're angry that I didn't let you spend my money on a vacation you mocked me for. That's not family. That's a scam." The silence that followed was louder than any shouting match we'd ever had. And I saw it then, just for a flicker, the way my aunt's eyes darted down, the way my sister's lips parted like she wanted to say something but couldn't, because deep down they knew I was right. My mom tried to recover, scoffing, calling me dramatic, but her voice cracked in a way that told me she felt the ground slipping. I stood, placed a 20 on the table for my meal, and told them flatly, "This is the last time you get to corner me like this. You don't get access to me unless you learn what respect means." And then I walked out, my heels clicking against the tile like punctuation, and I swear the air outside felt different, cleaner. Like I had stepped out of a smoke-filled room and finally into the open sky. After that dinner, the phone calls slowed, not because they had given up, but because they realized the more they pushed, the less access they had to me, and my silence was more punishing than any argument could have been. For years I had been their buffer, the one who smoothed things over when fights broke out, who lent the money no one else wanted to talk about, who showed up to family gatherings with gifts, so no one noticed how little effort they put in. And without me playing that role, the cracks widened fast. I started hearing whispers through mutual friends that my parents were fighting with my sister now, blaming her for not stepping up like I once did. And when she called me one evening, her voice sharp with frustration, accusing me of abandoning her to deal with them alone, I told her calmly, "I'm not abandoning you. I'm just refusing to drown with you." She didn't like that answer, but she didn't have a comeback either because she knew it was true. And while they scrambled, I began to build something new for myself, small at first. Dinners with friends who didn't measure my worth in dollars. Weekends spent exploring places I'd never taken time for because I was always on call for my family's demands. Mornings where I sat with my coffee and actually tasted it instead of chugging it while calculating bills in my head. It was like discovering pieces of myself I hadn't realized were missing, and with each one I found, I felt less and less tethered to the chaos I had left behind. What surprised me most was the absence of guilt. I thought walking away would leave me racked with second thoughts, but instead, it felt like breathing for the first time, like the weight on my chest had always been their expectations pressing down on me. And though I knew they would keep telling their story to anyone who'd listen, that I was cold, ungrateful, selfish, I didn't care anymore, because the people who mattered saw me differently. They saw me as strong, as someone who finally understood that being family doesn't mean being a doormat. And every time I caught my reflection in the mirror, I saw that too, a woman no longer begging for scraps of love, but someone who had finally stepped into her own life, unapologetic and free. By the time summer rolled around, the dynamic had shifted completely. Holidays came and went without a single invitation from them, though I saw on social media that they still held their barbecues and family dinners, posting photos carefully staged to look full and joyful. But I could see the hollowness behind their smiles. They were trying to prove they didn't need me, yet the very act of proving it gave them away. What they didn't know was that I didn't miss it. Not the forced laughter, not the digs hidden in jokes, not the way I always drove home with my stomach knotted. Instead, I spent that 4th of July with friends at a lake house, sitting barefoot on the dock, fireworks bursting overhead. And for once, I wasn't the one taking photos to send home, hoping for approval. I was just there, living in the moment, surrounded by people who saw me, not as a wallet or a failure, but as a friend worth having. And as the months passed, something even more unexpected happened. Word started to get back to me that some relatives, the ones who had always stayed quiet in the background, were beginning to ask questions. An older cousin reached out on Facebook, saying she admired me for standing up to my parents because she had been treated the same way once and never had the courage to walk away. A second cousin confided that she'd stopped attending gatherings too, because the judgment was suffocating. It dawned on me that maybe my silence hadn't just been freedom for me. It was a signal flare to others who had been quietly enduring, proof that breaking the cycle was possible. And as much as my parents tried to spin me as the villain, the longer I stayed firm, the clearer it became to everyone watching that their cruelty wasn't an isolated slip. It was a pattern. I hadn't just canceled their trip. I had canceled my role in their play, and without me feeding the script, the story was finally unraveling, exposing them for who they really were. The unraveling became impossible for them to hide when their anniversary finally arrived, the one I had originally planned to make unforgettable. They had told everyone a grand vacation was in the works, hinting at sandy beaches and luxury. But when the day came, they ended up at a local restaurant, the kind with paper menus and dim lighting. And though there's nothing wrong with that, for them it was humiliation. Because it wasn't about celebrating love, it was about showing off. My mom posted a few photos anyway, smiling too wide, tilting her wine glass just so. But I noticed there were no comments from the friends she used to brag to, no chorus of admiration. Word had already traveled. People knew the story didn't match the photos. And while they sat in that booth pretending everything was fine, I was miles away in the mountains at the retreat I had booked for myself, wrapped in a blanket on a cabin porch as the sun set across the valley, and for the first time in years I felt peace. My phone was silent, not buzzing with demands or insults, only the quiet crackle of the fire beside me and the rush of the wind through the trees. I thought about how much of my life I had spent chasing their approval, twisting myself into shapes that never fit, and I realized this was the anniversary I wanted to celebrate. Not theirs, but mine. The moment I finally stopped being their scapegoat and started being my own person. And though I knew they would never see it this way, the truth was clear. I hadn't taken anything from them. I had simply reclaimed everything they had taken from me, my time, my energy, my dignity, and turned it into something better. Something they could never touch again. Autumn came, and with it the kind of quiet I had never known before. A quiet not born of loneliness but of choice. The calm that settles when you no longer live in a state of constant apology. For years I had thought silence from my family would feel like exile, but instead, it felt like space. a wide-open field where I could finally plant something of my own. I started small, joining a hiking group on weekends, taking a cooking class on Wednesday nights, saying yes to invitations I used to decline because I was always on call for my parents' whims. Slowly, my life filled with people who didn't ask me to shrink or prove my worth. People who wanted me there simply because they enjoyed my company. And that shift was more healing than any apology my family could have given. Meanwhile, the cracks back home deepened. I heard from a cousin that my mother had started complaining that no one respected her anymore, that people whispered about her arrogance, that even her closest friends had stopped asking about the anniversary trip because they knew the truth. She tried to spin new stories, tried to paint me as unstable, ungrateful. But lies are fragile when they've been told too often, and every time she opened her mouth, more people seemed to notice the pattern. My father, once the silent enabler, started to show the strain too. At a family barbecue I didn't attend, he apparently snapped at my sister, shouting that she needed to pull her weight for once, a line so close to what they used to throw at me that it spread through the grapevine within hours. For years I had been their shield, their scapegoat, their sponge. Without me there, they turned on each other, and though I didn't rejoice in it, I couldn't deny the irony. I think what surprised me most was how natural it felt to let them go. How quickly my body adjusted to a life without walking on eggshells. I stopped checking my phone obsessively, stopped rehearsing conversations in my head, stopped trying to predict the next jab. In their absence, I discovered joy in the simplest places. Saturday mornings spent lingering in bed, afternoons lost in books I'd been too drained to read, evenings cooking meals just for myself and savoring them without someone criticizing how I seasoned the food. And each small act of self-care felt like an act of rebellion, a reminder that I didn't exist to be mocked, dismissed, or used. The more distance I gained, the clearer it all looked. Their cheap vacation comment hadn't been about the trip at all. It had been about me. About keeping me in the box they had built, where I would always be the daughter who tried but never succeeded, the one they could measure themselves against and feel superior. By canceling that trip, I hadn't just pulled away money or plans. I had pulled away their scapegoat, and without it, their illusion collapsed. I was no longer their proof that they were better. I was my own proof that I deserved better, and on one crisp October evening, as the leaves turned gold and the air smelled like wood smoke, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even hurt. I was free. And freedom, I learned, is the most expensive gift of all. Worth more than the $5,000 I had once spent on people who never intended to say thank you. Worth more than any trip. Worth more than any approval I had begged for. It was mine and I wasn't giving it back. Winter brought the final test, the kind I hadn't expected, but one that proved just how far I'd come. Around Christmas, my mother sent a card in the mail, something she hadn't done in years, with glittery lettering on the front and a neatly folded letter inside. At first glance, it looked like an olive branch, but as I read the carefully chosen words, I saw the same script she had always used. Lines about how family should stick together, about how life is short, and how resentment poisons the soul, all framed as if I were the one holding a grudge while she was the magnanimous matriarch extending grace. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of her cruelty, only a plea disguised as wisdom, designed to pull me back into orbit. Years ago, I would have clutched that card, convinced it meant she was ready to change, that maybe I just needed to try harder. But this time I slipped it back into the envelope and placed it in a drawer, not out of hope, but as a reminder, a souvenir of the old cycle I had finally broken. When New Year's came, I didn't call them. I didn't send gifts. Instead, I toasted with friends in a tiny apartment strung with fairy lights, counting down the seconds with people who laughed with me instead of at me, people who clinked glasses and hugged without conditions. And when midnight struck, I didn't make resolutions about fixing or mending or proving anything to anyone. My resolution was simple: to keep living in the life I had built for myself, a life where peace wasn't conditional, where love wasn't laced with cruelty. Meanwhile, I heard whispers through the grapevine that my parents were still sulking. still telling anyone who'd listen about the daughter who abandoned them. But the more they told the story, the less sympathy they received. Even the relatives who used to take their side had grown weary of the drama, shrugging and saying, "Well, maybe she just had enough." And that, I think, cut my mother more deeply than anything I could have said, because without the audience, her performance had no stage, and without the stage, she was just a bitter woman who had driven her own daughter away. And me? I was finally learning that revenge doesn't always look like fireworks or public takedowns. Sometimes it looks like walking away and letting the silence do the talking. Sometimes it looks like a woman who once emptied herself for everyone else sitting in her own kitchen, sipping coffee in peace, smiling because she knows she owes them nothing, not even a reaction. That was my revenge, living fully, freely, and without their chains wrapped around my ankles. And as the snow fell outside my window soft and steady, I knew with absolute certainty I would never go back. By spring, the silence between us wasn't just a pause. It had become permanent, a canyon too wide to cross. And though my mother still tried in small ways to tug at the edges, I no longer felt the pull. She sent an email in March with photos of my sister's kids, as if dangling them might soften me, with a single line beneath, "They miss their aunt." But the truth was, they didn't know me well enough to miss me, because every attempt I'd made to be in their lives had been brushed aside. Every gift I brought dismissed as not enough, every moment overshadowed by my mother's commentary. I stared at the email for a long time, then closed it without replying, because I had finally accepted that I wasn't responsible for holding together relationships built on someone else's conditions. It was around that same time I took a leap I never would have dared before. I used part of the money I'd saved from canceling the trip to enroll in a professional course, something I had dreamed of for years but always convinced myself I couldn't afford. Walking into that classroom, surrounded by people who weren't sizing me up through the lens of family hierarchy, but who simply shared the same passion, I felt a jolt of pride I hadn't known in decades. For once, my energy was building my future instead of cushioning theirs. And every assignment I completed felt like a brick laid in a foundation I had chosen for myself. Meanwhile, my parents' world kept shrinking. A cousin mentioned that my mom no longer bragged about family vacations at church because people had started asking uncomfortable questions, and when she tried to rant about me, someone finally said aloud what no one had dared before. Maybe she just got tired of being treated badly. That kind of blunt truth doesn't land softly, and I knew it must have cut through her pride like glass. And while they clung to their bitterness, I kept building new friends, new skills, even planning small trips for myself. Nothing extravagant, just enough to remind me that I was allowed to experience joy without apology. Looking back, I realized something I never thought possible. The $5,000 I once thought I had wasted wasn't wasted at all. It was the price of clarity, the tuition I paid for a lesson that set me free. That money bought me the moment my mother's words, "We're too good for your cheap vacation," turned from a wound into a key, unlocking the door I had been too scared to walk through. And once I stepped through, I never looked back, because in the end, their insult became my liberation, and the truest revenge wasn't their downfall. It was my rise. By the time summer came back around, a full year since I had first booked that doomed anniversary trip, I could barely recognize the woman I used to be. Back then, I was exhausted, stretched thin, desperate for even a crumb of acknowledgement. Now I woke up each morning in a life that felt like it was finally mine. Small, simple, but undeniably free. My apartment was filled with little touches that made me happy. Plants I actually had time to water. Shelves stacked with books I wanted to read instead of dusty obligations. A kitchen where I cooked meals for myself without fear of someone mocking the way I seasoned them. And every detail was proof that I had stopped building my world around people who only wanted to tear it down. It didn't mean they stopped trying. On their next anniversary, my mother attempted another performance, posting a long, dramatic status about the heartache of being abandoned by your own child. as though she were the tragic heroine in some family drama. But the comments told a different story this time. Some polite sympathy, yes, but also blunt questions she didn't answer. Did you ever think maybe she just needed space? And respect goes both ways. The tide had shifted, and though she couldn't admit it, she knew her grip on the narrative was slipping. Without me feeding her story, she had nothing but her own bitterness to showcase, and people were beginning to see it for what it was. Meanwhile, I kept moving forward. That professional course I had taken opened doors I never imagined. I landed a new position with better pay and a healthier environment, one where no one called me cheap for trying, where effort was rewarded instead of mocked. I celebrated my new job by booking another trip, this time for myself and a friend, spending less than half of what I once blew on my parents, yet gaining 10 times the joy. As we sat on a sunlit balcony overlooking the ocean, sipping coffee and laughing until our cheeks hurt, I thought about how different it felt to travel without the weight of obligation, without waiting for a thank you that would never come. And here's the truth I had never dared say out loud before. I don't regret a single thing. Not the trip I canceled, not the family I walked away from, not even the years I spent trying, because they taught me exactly what I would no longer tolerate. My mother thought she was cutting me down when she said I was too cheap, but what she really did was cut the cord I had been too afraid to sever myself. Her insult set me free, and now, when I look at my life, the peace, the self-respect, the friendships built on mutual care, I realize I didn't lose a family. I escaped a prison. And that, more than any staged vacation photo or hollow toast, is the kind of anniversary worth celebrating forever. A full cycle had passed by then, 4 seasons without them, and the strangest part was how natural it felt. What once would have seemed unthinkable, living without the constant orbit of my parents and their demands, had become my new normal, and not a painful one, but a steady, grounded peace. I didn't spend my evenings rehearsing what I'd say to defend myself. I didn't hold my phone with a knot in my stomach, waiting for the next explosion. Instead, I came home to quiet, to candles lit on my own terms, to dinners eaten slowly without anyone criticizing how much or how little I'd put on my plate. That summer, while my parents scrambled to host another anniversary celebration that no one seemed eager to attend, I hosted something of my own, a dinner party in my apartment with people who loved me without conditions. We sat around my small table, plates full of food I had cooked myself, glasses raised in laughter, and as I looked around the room, I realized this was family, not defined by blood, but by care, respect, and joy. And in that moment, I finally let go of the last lingering ache, the part of me that still wondered if maybe I had gone too far. Because here it was, the proof in front of me. Life didn't just go on without their approval, it thrived. Meanwhile, word drifted through the grapevine that their world had grown quieter. My mother, once the queen of social gatherings, had fewer friends to impress. People had grown tired of the performance, tired of the endless drama. My father, always the silent partner, had grown more withdrawn, his health faltering under the weight of constant tension. And my sister, left to pick up the slack, had begun to complain in whispers of the very burdens I had carried for years. None of it surprised me. When you build a life on belittling others, eventually the ground crumbles beneath you. What did surprise me was how little satisfaction I felt in their unraveling. It wasn't triumph or gloating that filled me. It was distance, detachment, a kind of freedom that meant I didn't need them to fall for me to rise. My revenge wasn't their collapse. It was my peace, my laughter, my ability to stand in a room full of people who loved me for who I was and know, without question, that I belonged. And maybe that's the ending they never expected. That their attempt to cut me down didn't leave me smaller. It left me standing taller, stronger, untethered. Because the truth is, their cheap vacation insult wasn't the destruction of me. It was the making of me. And though they will never see it, I know it now with unshakable certainty. I am no longer the daughter who begged to be enough. I am the woman who walked away and built a life where enough is exactly who I am. The years of swallowing my pride had trained me to think that endings had to be loud, dramatic, full of screaming matches and slammed doors. But the truth was, my ending with them was quiet, steady, and permanent, like the slow turning of a tide. By the time the second anniversary rolled around since I'd canceled their trip, I wasn't bracing for their tantrums anymore. I wasn't waiting for the phone to ring. I wasn't even curious about what story my mother was spinning this time. I had outgrown the stage where her words held power over me. Instead, I was standing barefoot on a balcony halfway across the world, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors I didn't even know existed. A trip I had planned and paid for myself without a shred of guilt. Beside me was a friend who had become like family. Someone who knew the full story and never once called me too much, or too cheap, or not enough. We clinked our glasses together and laughed at something small and silly. And in that moment, I realized this was the life I had been chasing all along. Not their grudging approval, but the freedom to exist without apology. It's strange how once you walk away, the past starts to lose its grip. I no longer replayed every insult in my head, no longer tried to rewrite their words into something kinder. I didn't need to. What happened, happened. They showed me who they were, and I finally believed them. And believing them gave me back everything they had taken: my time, my money, my joy, my sense of worth. I stopped trying to fix the unfixable, and instead, I poured that energy into myself. I finished my course, moved into a better job, traveled not to impress anyone but to nourish myself, and built friendships that didn't feel like transactions. The more I invested in myself, the smaller their shadow became, until one day I realized it wasn't looming over me at all anymore. It was just gone. And yet, sometimes late at night, I would think back to that one moment in the hotel lobby, the envelope still warm from my hand, my mother's smirk slicing through me like glass as she called my gift cheap. For years, I would have let those words rot inside me, festering until I believed them. But now when I remember, I don't feel small. I feel powerful. Because that was the moment everything changed, the moment I finally stopped begging and started living. That insult wasn't my humiliation, it was my liberation. And though they will never understand it, though they will cling to their bitterness until the end, I know the truth. I am no longer the daughter desperate to be seen. I am the woman who saw herself, and that is the kind of victory no one can take away. So here I am, years later, looking back on the life I once thought I had to endure, and realizing I never truly lost anything worth keeping. My parents still sit in their circle of pride and bitterness, still spinning tales about how I abandoned them, still pointing to me as the one who broke the family. Maybe they believe it. Maybe they need to. But the truth is simpler. I stopped playing the part they wrote for me, and without me propping up their performance, the whole show collapsed. And I don't feel guilty about that anymore. I don't feel guilty about canceling their vacation, about walking out of that restaurant, about closing the door when my mother came pounding. Because those moments weren't betrayals, they were boundaries, the kind I should have set long ago. The kind that saved me from living a life where love was just another word for control. My revenge wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't about destroying them. It was about refusing to be destroyed myself. It was about redirecting the energy I had poured into pleasing people who would never be pleased, and using it to build something real, something mine. And in that rebuilding, I found pieces of myself I thought were gone forever. My laughter, my confidence, my joy in the smallest things. I found out that family doesn't have to mean blood, that sometimes the family you create with friends, mentors, and even strangers who choose to see you is far stronger than the one you're born into. I still remember the sting of those words. We're too good for your cheap vacation. But now I carry them differently. They're not a scar anymore. They're a reminder. A marker of the day I chose myself over their approval. That was the day I stopped being their scapegoat, their wallet, their punchline. That was the day I became free. So when I sit here now sipping coffee in my own kitchen, sunlight warming the floor, plants thriving in the window, laughter from friends still echoing from the night before, I know the truth. They will never change, and I no longer need them to. The most powerful revenge I could ever have is this: living a life so full, so peaceful, so unapologetically mine, that their insults echo into nothing. And maybe, if you're listening to this and wondering whether you should draw your own line, here's my answer. You don't owe anyone your silence, your money, or your worth. You don't have to keep giving to people who only take. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is cancel the trip, close the door, walk away. And when you do, you'll find what I found. That freedom tastes better than approval ever could. So no, I didn't ruin their anniversary. I saved my own. And it's one I'll celebrate every year for the rest of my life.